This is Oliver Phillips. There is perhaps no place with more profound influence on the civil rights movement than the African American church. During a tumultuous period in the 1950s and 60s, churches, especially those in the South, were the backbone of the movement. Historically, African American churches have been safe havens where African Americans could meet with their neighbors, their friends, and family in a comfortable environment. Churches were arguably some of the only places people of African descent felt free. During the civil rights movement, they took on an even more significant role. African American churches were vital to the success of the civil rights movement as we know it today. They hosted mass meetings, were meeting points for rallies and marches, and provided much needed emotional, physical, moral, and spiritual support. These churches gave the community strength to endure and ultimately succeed in gaining equal human rights for every American, regardless of color or creed. So I have prepared this blog on behalf of the Black Church in its response to the need, the pain, the ostracization in the Black communities, in all communities. And so here is my blog, Why Black History and the Black Church. Most of the first Black congregations and churches formed before 1800 were founded by free Blacks. For example, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Springfield Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, Petersburg in Virginia, and oldest churches in the United States was founded about 1790 by the slave Peter Durant. The oldest Black Roman Catholic church, St. Augustine in New Orleans, was founded by free Blacks in 1841. After slavery in the United States was abolished, segregationist attitudes towards Blacks and whites worshiping together were not as predominant in the North as compared to the South. Many white Protestant ministers moved to the South after the Civil War to establish churches where Black and white people worshiped together. In Wesleyan Holiness denominations, such as the Church of God, the belief that interracial worship was a sign of the true church was taught, with both whites and Blacks ministering regularly in Church of God congregations, which invited people of all races to worship there. In some parts of the country, such as New Orleans, Black and white Catholics had worshiped together for almost 150 years before the Civil War, albeit without full equality and primarily under French and Spanish rule. Attacks by the Ku Klux Klan or other whites opposed to such efforts thwarted those attempts and even prevented Blacks from worshiping in the same buildings as whites. In communities where Black and white people worshiped together in the South, shortly after the Civil War, the persecution of African Americans was less severe. Yet, freed Blacks most often established congregations and church facilities separate from their white neighbors, who were often their former owners. In the Roman Catholic Church, the rising tide of segregation eventually resulted in segregated parishes across the South, even in places where segregation had not previously been the norm. Evangelical Baptists and Methodist preachers traveled throughout the South in the Great Awakening of the late 18th century. They appealed directly to slaves, and a few thousand slaves were converted as a result. Black individuals found opportunities to have active roles in new congregations, especially in the Baptist church, where slaves were appointed as leaders and preachers. Of course, they were excluded from such roles in the Anglican and in the Episcopal church. As they listened to readings, slaves developed their own interpretations of the scriptures and found inspiration in stories of deliverance, such as the Exodus out of Egypt. Nat Turner, an enslaved Baptist preacher, was inspired to armed rebellion against slavery in an uprising that killed about 50 white people in Virginia. As late as 1800, most slaves in the United States had not been converted to Christianity. In the years that followed, however, widespread Protestant evangelicalism, emphasizing individual freedom and direct communication with God, brought about the first large-scale conversion of enslaved men and women. At first, itinerant ministers, captivating large audiences at revivals and camp meetings across the North and the South during the middle part of the century, reached only a small percentage of the slave population with their calls to Christianity. Larger members of black men and women were converted during the resurgence and intensification of revivalism during the Second Great Awakening of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At that time, Baptist and Methodist ministers appealed to the slave and free black populations, preaching a plain-styled message of hope and redemption, while also catering to matters of worship that African men and women carried or brought with them to America. Whereas an earlier generation of evangelical preachers had opposed slavery in the South, during the early 19th century, Protestant clergymen began to defend the institution, invoking a Christian hierarchy in which slaves were bound to obey their masters. For many slaveholders, this outlook not only made evangelical Christianity more palatable, but also provided a strong argument for converting slaves and establishing multicultural and biracial churches. Even so, with much of the religious life of the slave community existing as an invisible institution beyond the purview of whites or formal churches, white control over African American religious practices and spiritual beliefs was limited. Slave preachers might emphasize the need for obedience to the master while whites were present, but among other slaves, they reformulated their teachings, emphasizing themes of suffering and redemption. Slaves sang spirituals filled with the lyrics about salvation and references to biblical figures like Moses, who led his people to freedom. On occasion, these songs functioned even more explicitly as expressions of resistance, encoding messages that secret gatherings or carrying messages as to how to escape. While some planters became convinced of Christianity as a type of social control, others welcomed ministers to the slave quarters and built plantation chapels out of genuine Christian impulses. But Regardless of motives, however, slaveholders remain mindful of the potential subversiveness of religion among these slaves. In the 1820s and 30s, two of the most significant slave rebellions in American history were plotted by Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, two men driven by religious fire. While fear of the slave insurrection led to prohibitions on black churches meeting openly in many parts in the South, the black church movement flourished in the North. As members of the church, blacks were ostensibly the brothers and sisters of whites, equals in the eyes of God. This sentiment, however, was instrumental in helping blacks to gain the right to be ordained as Baptist and Methodist ministers, but it did not prevent discriminatory practice within the church, including segregated seating. In Philadelphia, blacks established the well-known Mother Bethel Episcopal Church in 1794 as the culminating response to this type of blatant discrimination. Black churches in the North continued to grow into the 19th century, providing for much more than the spiritual needs of the black community. They aided in the adjustment of new black residents, acted as mediators in the personal lives of black people, and played a vital role in anti-slavery activities, including the protection of fugitive slaves. Black ministers like Philadelphia's Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and Boston's Thomas Paul were among the strongest leaders in black communities. As we celebrate Black History Month this year, I trust that the black church will understand and appreciate the role that it has played in the civil rights movement and in the history of the black church in America. And it is much more than the history of black people, it is the history of America. Here is the prayer for the church. In authenticity and worship and prayer, we will keep celebrating the sacred until we embody it. In life-centered diversity of community, we will keep practicing love until we get it right. As a critical yet hopeful prophetic minority, we will keep calling for justice until it prevails. In the midst of the groaning of creation, we will keep longing for kingdom until kingdom comes. God bless you. Happy Black History Month.